The evening air in Maplewood was calm, almost unnervingly so. It was the kind of quiet that lulled the small town into a rhythm of routine. The clinking of dishes in homes, distant sounds of TVs playing, and the faint hum of crickets as night crept in. The streets, bathed in the fading glow of streetlights, seemed ready for a peaceful conclusion to the day. Then came the distant wail of sirens. An ambulance tore through the main road, its lights flashing urgently, cutting through the tranquil night like a knife. Inside, paramedics worked furiously over an unseen patient. Their only focus was to reach the hospital, to outrun time, and to give this person, whoever they were, a fighting chance. But as they sped through the heart of Maplewood, the unthinkable happened. A dog appeared. The ambulance screeched to a halt, its lights casting eerie shadows across the road. There, just feet in front of the vehicle, stood a large, scruffy dog, its matted fur ruffling in the light breeze. It barked incessantly, a deep, guttural sound that echoed in the otherwise silent street. The paramedics inside exchanged confused glances. The driver honked the horn repeatedly, trying to scare the dog away, but it wouldn't move. "What the hell is this dog doing?" one of the paramedics muttered, staring out the windshield. The dog, as if understanding the urgency of the situation, did something no one expected. It began pacing frantically, back and forth, blocking the path of the ambulance as though it had a mission. With every step it took, its barking grew louder, more frantic, its eyes locked onto the vehicle. The ambulance's siren wailed again, but the dog didn't flinch. Bystanders began to gather along the sidewalks, pulled from their homes by the commotion. Mothers held their children close, watching in confusion. Some tried whistling to the dog, others even threw out bits of food in hopes of luring it away. Nothing worked. The dog was resolute. Among the growing crowd stood Rachel Adams, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched the scene unfold with a furrowed brow. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but something about this dog's behavior unsettled her. It wasn't just a frightened animal caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, this dog seemed deliberate, determined. Rachel, a veterinarian in town for as long as anyone could remember, had a unique connection to animals. She understood their language, their silent cues. And right now, this dog was screaming something she couldn't yet decipher. "Let me try," she called out, pushing her way through the crowd. Her voice carried a calm authority that made people step aside without question. Approaching the dog cautiously, she kept her movements slow, her hands relaxed at her sides. The barking quieted slightly as the dog's attention shifted to her. "Hey there, buddy," she murmured softly. "What's going on, huh? What are you trying to say?" The dog, still tense, stopped pacing but remained fixated on the ambulance. Its dark eyes were wide, filled with something that Rachel couldn't quite place. Fear? Urgency? Either way, it wasn't typical stray behavior. Rachel crouched down a few feet away, giving the dog space, but keeping herself in its line of sight. She extended a hand, palm open, letting the dog decide how to proceed. "Come on," she coaxed, her voice gentle but steady. "I know you're trying to tell us something, but you gotta move now." They need to get through. For a moment it seemed like the dog might ignore her. Then, slowly, it took a tentative step forward. Its barking ceased completely, replaced by the quiet panting of an exhausted animal. Another step, then another. The dog, still wary, sniffed at Rachel's outstretched hand, a brief moment of trust passing between them. Finally, as if satisfied, it backed away from the road, sitting just off to the side, its eyes never leaving the ambulance. The paramedics wasted no time, their vehicle roaring back to life as it sped away into the night. The gathered crowd began to disperse, whispering among themselves about the oddity they'd just witnessed. But Rachel's gaze stayed on the dog. "Why?" she whispered to herself. watching as the animal sat quietly now, no longer the frantic creature that had just brought an ambulance to a halt. There was something behind those eyes, an intelligence, a purpose that went beyond mere coincidence. This wasn't just a stray dog lost in the streets of Maplewood. Rachel stood slowly, her thoughts swirling with questions. What had driven the dog to act so deliberately? And more importantly, what was it trying to convey? The dog sat quietly in Rachel's passenger seat, its large eyes tracking every movement of the trees as they passed. It was calm now, but there was a tension in its posture, as if it was ready to leap into action at any moment. Rachel glanced at the dog, who she had begun to think of as Ranger, a name that somehow seemed fitting for an animal with such purpose. "You're not a stray, are you?" she murmured, more to herself than to Ranger. The streets of Maplewood were empty at this hour, the late-night quiet settling over the town. The ambulance was long gone, and the small crowd that had gathered around the strange event had already retreated to the warmth of their homes. But Rachel's mind was still racing. When she arrived home, Ranger followed her inside without hesitation. There was no awkward pacing at the door, no signs of uncertainty. It was as if he knew this was a temporary stop, a place to rest, before something more important needed to happen. She filled a bowl with water and set it down on the kitchen floor. Ranger lapped at it quickly, his eyes constantly scanning the room as though assessing his surroundings. Rachel watched him with a mix of curiosity and concern. Ranger didn't respond in any outward way, of course, but his movements were far too deliberate, too calculated for a regular stray. After finishing the water, he looked back at Rachel, eyes sharp and alert. Something was still gnawing at her, something about the way he'd stopped the ambulance, almost like he was guarding something. Or someone. "All right," she sighed, rubbing her temples. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow we'll see if we can figure out what's going on with you." But rest wouldn't come easily. The next morning, Rachel was jolted awake by the soft padding of Ranger's paws moving through the house. She opened her eyes just in time to see him heading toward the door, his nose sniffing at the crack of light coming from beneath it. There was a strange urgency in his movements, a quiet insistence that pulled her from the comfort of her bed. "Where are you off to now?" she asked, throwing on her jacket as Ranger glanced back at her briefly, before nudging the door with his snout. Outside, the air was crisp, the early morning sun barely touching the tops of the trees. Ranger took off at a brisk pace, not running, but leading her with purpose. Rachel followed, her breath coming out in short puffs as she tried to keep up. They wound through the familiar streets of Maplewood, but it wasn't long before Rachel began to notice a pattern in Ranger's route. He led her past a charred house on the edge of town, the remnants of a fire that had torn through it weeks ago. Ranger stopped at the sidewalk, his nose hovering just above the ground, sniffing intently. He let out a low whine before moving on, his pace picking up slightly as they neared another site. This one a small diner, its windows blackened and broken from yet another fire that had struck a month prior. Rachel's brow furrowed. She hadn't thought much of the fires before. Town gossip had chalked it up to faulty wiring. But the way Ranger lingered at each site, his nose darting from one spot to the next, as though searching for something, it didn't feel like coincidence. "What are you looking for?" Rachel whispered, more to herself than to Ranger. By the time they made their way back home, Rachel's curiosity had shifted into something else. A gnawing suspicion that there was more to these fires, more to this dog than met the eye. That night, after feeding Ranger and settling him into a makeshift bed in the corner of her living room, Rachel sat at her kitchen table, the dim glow of her laptop illuminating the darkened room. She typed quickly, fingers dancing across the keys as she pulled up news reports and local articles about the recent string of fires. There were 5 in total, all within the last 2 months. No cause had been officially determined. Rachel glanced over at Ranger, who lay awake, watching her with those same alert eyes. It was as if he knew she was digging for answers. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. Something wasn't adding up. The fires. The dog. Ranger's determination to visit those locations. And the way he'd stopped the ambulance last night, as though he knew something dangerous was happening. Rachel sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. I don't know what you're trying to tell me, but I'm going to figure this out. Ranger remained silent, but the look he gave her felt almost like an understanding. Rachel stood in front of the Maplewood fire station, her fingers tightening around Ranger's leash. The building, a modest brick structure with faded red doors, seemed too quiet for her liking. It had been 2 days since Ranger had led her through the town, visiting those eerie, fire-scorched places, and the questions buzzing in her head were too many to ignore. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the stillness of the afternoon. For a moment, nothing happened, and Rachel considered turning back. Maybe this was a dead end. But then heavy footsteps approached, and the door creaked open. A young firefighter stood in the doorway, his gaze immediately drawn to Ranger. His expression shifted, recognition flickering in his eyes. I know that dog, he said, his voice low but certain. Rachel felt her stomach drop. You do? The man nodded, stepping back slightly as if the weight of the realization hit him. Yeah, that's Ethan Parker's dog. He's one of us, a firefighter here. His eyes lifted from Ranger to meet Rachel's. Ethan's been missing for a while now. Rachel blinked, feeling a surge of mixed emotions hit her all at once. Ethan Parker. The name struck her like a bolt of lightning. Finally, a lead. But it didn't bring relief. If anything, it brought a new layer of unease. Missing? How long? She asked, her voice steady despite the questions swirling in her head. The firefighter, whose name tag read Carter, scratched the back of his neck. Close to 1 week now. No one's heard from him. We thought maybe he just took off for a bit. Needed space. But, now I'm not so sure. Rachel looked down at Ranger, who sat calmly at her side. The dog hadn't flinched at the mention of his owner, but there was a tension in the air, like an invisible thread connecting everything. Ranger, Ethan, the fires. He disappeared around the same time the fires started, didn't he? She asked, her voice quieter now, almost like she didn't want the answer. Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. What are you getting at? Rachel hesitated for a moment before speaking. Ranger, he's been leading me to the sites of those fires. Every time, he takes me to a new place, like he's searching for something, or someone. I didn't think much of it at first, but now, with what you're saying about Ethan... Carter exhaled sharply, glancing down at the dog again. Ethan was investigating those fires on his own. We knew something was up. He had this gut feeling that they weren't just accidents, but then one day he just didn't show up to work. No calls, nothing. And now his dog turns up. Rachel's heart raced. Do you think he's in danger? Carter didn't answer right away. He leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms as he stared at Ranger. I don't know. But Ethan wouldn't just abandon his dog. That much I know. The weight of his words settled over Rachel like a heavy fog. Ethan's disappearance was no coincidence. And now Ranger was here, trying to lead her to something. Maybe to Ethan himself. The realization made her chest tighten. The fires, the missing firefighter, the dog who seemed to know more than anyone. It was all connected. She could feel it. I need to find him, Rachel said, her voice firm but laced with a quiet desperation she hadn't meant to reveal. Carter nodded slowly. I'll help however I can. But I need to warn you, if Ethan was onto something, it might be dangerous. The fires, they've been getting worse. Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on her. I can handle it. For the next few days, Rachel threw herself into the search. She combed through every piece of information she could find on the fires, spending long nights at her kitchen table, laptop glowing in the dim light, news articles and fire reports spread out in front of her. Each time she thought she found a connection, it led to another question. Ethan had been onto something, and Rachel knew Ranger was the key. But the deeper she dug, the more dangerous it felt. Her eyes burned from the lack of sleep, her mind racing through possibilities. She couldn't shake the feeling that Ranger was trying to tell her something, pulling her in a direction she hadn't fully grasped yet. The dog stayed close to her during the night, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos inside her head. The next few days, Rachel threw herself into uncovering the truth. She walked through Maplewood with Ranger at her side, his calm but deliberate pace guiding her. Each day, they visited different sites, some still marked by the blackened ruins of past fires, others left in eerie silence. The more she dug, the more her curiosity morphed into an uneasy sense of urgency. Rachel stopped by the small cafe on Main Street, where Maplewood's older residents gathered. She approached an elderly man, a long-time town local, sipping his coffee with slow deliberation. "Mr. McCafferty, I'm looking into the recent fires," she said, keeping her voice casual. "You've lived here a long time. Did you ever know a firefighter named Ethan Parker?" The man looked up from his cup, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Ethan? Yeah, I remember him. Good man, B. Bit of a loner, though. Kept to himself more than he used to in the last few months before he vanished." Rachel pulled up a chair, encouraged by his response. "Do you know why? Did he seem different in any way?" McCafferty nodded, his gaze drifting out the window as if recalling memories. "Started acting strange, asking questions around town. Heard he was looking into those fires." Rachel's heart raced slightly. She pressed on. "Poking around, did he tell anyone what he found?" "Nah," McCafferty replied, shaking his head. "He stopped talking to most people before he disappeared. But word was, he didn't believe those fires were accidents." Rachel sat back, processing his words. Ethan had been investigating the fires, but why hadn't anyone looked into it further? And why had he vanished? She left the cafe and wandered toward the outskirts of town, where Ranger led her through quiet, deserted streets. Every place he took her seemed to pull her deeper into Ethan's footsteps. The burned-out buildings they passed weren't random. Ranger moved with purpose, his nose twitching as he paused at familiar corners. By the third day, Rachel's mind was working in overdrive. She found herself at the fire station again, speaking with anyone who would give her a minute. Ethan's colleagues all described him in similar terms: brave, committed, but troubled in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. One firefighter mentioned Ethan spending late nights in the records room, poring over old files about previous fires, his behavior growing more erratic. It was becoming clearer. Ethan hadn't just been looking into the recent fires, he was obsessed with them, and now he was gone. Ranger stopped suddenly as they neared an alley on the edge of town, his ears perking up. Rachel followed his gaze to a patch of scorched earth where another fire had broken out a month ago. The building was a total loss, but there was something in the air, an unsettled energy that made Rachel pause. "Ranger," she whispered, as if afraid to disturb the silence. "You're showing me what he saw, aren't you?" The dog didn't respond, but his presence felt like a connection to Ethan, as if Ranger was retracing his steps, trying to communicate what had gone wrong. The more Rachel pieced together Ethan's story, the more anxious she became. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away, that whatever Ethan had discovered was dangerous. and that danger was still lurking in Maplewood, hidden behind the smouldering remnants of the fires. Rachel's sleep grew restless as her nights filled with frantic thoughts. Ranger often lay by the foot of her bed, his watchful eyes never fully closing, as if he too was waiting for the next clue to present itself. "We're running out of time," Rachel muttered to herself one night as she sat staring out her window, watching the shadows of the town stretch long and still. The realization hit her hard. If Ethan had found something big, something dangerous, then the fires and his disappearance weren't isolated events. The cold morning air bit at Rachel's cheeks as she walked alongside Ranger, her footsteps slow but deliberate. They were heading toward the edge of Maplewood, near the run-down part of town where the fires had started. Ranger moved with the same urgency as before, his nose occasionally twitching toward the ground, eyes sharp as though he were hunting for something unseen. Rachel, though growing accustomed to his behavior, still found herself in awe of the dog's determination. They stopped at the charred remains of an old house, its walls crumbled into ash and smoke-stained debris. Rachel had been here once before, but this time she had a purpose. She began knocking on doors, starting with the closest neighbor, a middle-aged man with a salt-and-pepper beard who cracked open his door just enough to squint at her. "Morning," Rachel started, her voice steady. "I'm looking into the fires. Did you see or hear anything unusual around the time this house burned down?" The man shrugged, his eyes drifting to Ranger. "Only thing I remember is seeing that firefighter. Ethan Parker, right? A couple of days before it happened. He was poking around the house, looked like he was inspecting something." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "Ethan was here? Before the fire?" "Yeah," the man replied, scratching his head. "Didn't think much of it at the time. Fires happen, and he was just doing his job, I guess." Rachel thanked him and moved on to the next house. But her thoughts were racing. Another mention of Ethan, right before a fire. She was starting to see the pattern now. Ethan wasn't just responding to these incidents. He'd been investigating them before they happened. And whatever he'd uncovered had put him in danger. As she continued to speak with residents, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. A few locals had seen Ethan near the other burned buildings as well, always just before the fires. A young woman even recalled seeing him talking to someone in a dark coat, though she couldn't remember the man's face. By midday, Rachel's suspicion had solidified into something more troubling. Ethan had found something he wasn't supposed to know, and now he was gone, leaving only Ranger behind to retrace his steps. Rachel crouched down beside Ranger, her hand resting gently on his back. "You're still following him, aren't you?" she murmured. The dog turned to look at her, his intelligent eyes reflecting the same determination she felt. The more Rachel thought about it, the more she realized that Ethan had been onto something far bigger than a series of accidental blazes. There was intent behind these fires, and it was clear that Ethan had gotten too close to the truth. The fires were no longer just unexplained incidents. They were deliberate acts. She glanced at Ranger, who stood beside her, tail twitching slightly, as if he too was sensing the rising stakes. This wasn't just about following Ethan anymore. They were unraveling a conspiracy, and every step they took was leading them closer to the heart of it. Rachel's attachment to the mystery and to Ranger had deepened without her even noticing. The long nights spent poring over Ethan's notes, the quiet mornings walking through burned-out neighborhoods, and the constant growing fear that time was slipping away. Everything felt more urgent now. Rachel's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the car bounced along the dirt road, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound cutting through the stillness of the night. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, alert, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The dog had been restless all day, more insistent than usual, leading Rachel out of town and towards the outskirts of Maplewood. They were heading to a place Rachel had heard about, but never visited. The old, abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. It had been a hub of activity once, decades ago, but now it sat decaying, long forgotten by most. That was until the rumors started circulating about strange noises coming from inside. The whispers of people hearing odd sounds, groans, scraping metal, had piqued her curiosity. But now, with Ranger pulling her in that direction, it didn't feel like idle gossip anymore. Something was there. She parked a little distance away, the silhouette of the warehouse looming ahead in the darkness. Rachel stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the cold air. Ranger moved ahead, silently slipping into the shadows, his nose low to the ground as he led the way. The warehouse was just as eerie as she had imagined. Tall, skeletal, with broken windows and rusted doors hanging off their hinges. Ranger sniffed at the ground, his movements purposeful as they circled the perimeter. Then, with a low whine, he pushed his nose against a side door, nudging it open with ease. Rachel hesitated for a moment, a chill running down her spine. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside. The air was heavy with dust, and the floor was littered with debris. A faint smell, metallic and damp, hung in the air. She followed Ranger deeper into the building, her footsteps barely making a sound. Then she heard it, a faint groan, a soft shuffle of movement coming from the far corner of the warehouse. Rachel's pulse quickened. She stepped closer, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. And there, slumped against a stack of crates, was a man. His clothes were torn and bloodied, his face pale and gaunt. It took her a moment to realize who she was looking at. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Ethan Parker, the man who had been missing for weeks, barely looked like the brave firefighter everyone had described. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow, and there were dark bruises on his arms and face. Blood stained his shirt, seeping from a wound in his side. Ranger moved towards him, nosing at his hand gently. Ethan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment they locked on Rachel, confusion clouding his gaze. Who are you?" he rasped, his voice weak, barely above a whisper. "I'm Rachel," she said quickly, kneeling beside him. "You're going to be okay. I'll get you out of here." Ethan's eyes darted around, as though searching for something, or someone. "I can't let them—" His words trailed off as his head lolled back against the crates. His hand weakly grasped at Rachel's arm, and his breathing grew more labored. Rachel could feel the panic rising in her chest. "Ethan, stay with me. What happened? Who did this to you?" But his eyes were already closing, his strength fading fast. "Mason," he muttered, the name barely audible. "Walter Mason. Behind it, the fires, controlling everything." The name hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. Walter Mason, the man in the ambulance, the man who Ranger had stopped that night. He was behind the fires. The shock of the realization coursed through her, but there was no time to process it now. Ethan's breathing was growing shallower by the second. She acted quickly, pulling out her phone to call for help. Her fingers shook as she dialed, and her voice was hoarse as she gave the dispatcher their location. Ethan's grip on her arm slackened, and he slipped into unconsciousness, his head resting limply against the crate. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she knelt beside him, keeping pressure on his wound, while Ranger sat silently at her side, his eyes never leaving Ethan. They had found him, but it was clear that this was only the beginning. The fires, the disappearances, Mason's involvement, it was all connected. Rachel sat by Ethan's hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling the room. The quiet beep of machines echoed in the background, but her focus was entirely on the man lying before her. Ethan was still pale, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, but he had insisted on telling her everything. Ranger lay curled at his feet, vigilant and calm, but his eyes followed every movement as if understanding the gravity of the moment. "Walter Mason," Ethan began, his voice strained but steady. "He's the one behind all of this. The fires, the disappearances, it all traces back to him." Rachel leaned in closer, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She had suspected as much after hearing Mason's name whispered in the warehouse, but now hearing Ethan confirm it made it all too real. "It started a few months ago," Ethan continued, his gaze distant as if reliving the memories. "I knew something wasn't right. The fires were too precise, always targeting properties linked to people who had crossed Mason, debtors, rivals, anyone who threatened his grip on the town. He used the fires to wipe out his problems, make them disappear like they never existed." Rachel remained silent, letting his words sink in. Mason's method was brutal, calculating, and it had worked, until Ethan got too close. "One day, I followed a lead to Mason's office," Ethan said, wincing as he shifted slightly. "I was hoping to dig up something solid, something that would tie him to the arsons. But when I got there, Mason was in the middle of a meeting. I waited, watching from across the street, and then he collapsed. Stomach pain. He looked bad, so his assistant called for an ambulance." Rachel's brow furrowed. The ambulance? She remembered that night. The dog, the ambulance being blocked by Ranger. It was all connected. Yeah. Ethan nodded weakly. "When I saw Mason being taken away, I knew I had a narrow window. So I made my move. I broke into his office, started going through his files. I didn't have much time, but I found enough. Ledgers, documents, names of people who had been targeted. It was all there, hidden in plain sight." He paused for a moment, catching his breath. Rachel waited, her heart pounding, every detail pulling her deeper into the nightmare Mason had created. "I knew I couldn't take everything," Ethan continued, "so I grabbed what I could, but then I had an idea. I took one of his ties from the office, figured it was soaked in his scent. I called Ranger over, let him sniff it, and ordered him to track Mason. I didn't know how long I had before someone found out I was there." "What happened next?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's face darkened. "I was about to leave when I heard footsteps. They must have known I'd be there. Before I could react, someone grabbed me from behind, knocked me out cold. When I woke up, I was in that warehouse." Rachel swallowed hard, the pieces falling into place. Ranger had escaped with Mason's scent, and that's how he had ended up blocking the ambulance. He recognized Mason inside, just like Ethan had planned. "Mason doesn't leave loose ends," Ethan continued, his voice trembling slightly. "They beat me, tried to get me to tell them what I'd found. They kept me locked up, waiting to see what I knew. But Ranger, he got away. I knew he would." Rachel looked down at the dog, her chest tightening with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Ranger had been the one constant, the one who had led her to Ethan and unraveled this entire mystery. "We need to stop him," Ethan said, his voice barely a rasp. "He's not just burning down buildings, he's burning down people's lives. If we don't act now, more people are going to get hurt." Rachel sat back in her chair, the enormity of the situation pressing down on her. Mason's actions weren't just criminal. They were a calculated, ruthless effort to control the town. And Ethan had almost died trying to stop him. But Rachel wasn't the same person she had been when this all started. The quiet curiosity that had driven her in the beginning had transformed into something much stronger, a resolve to finish what Ethan had started. "I'll help you," she said firmly, her eyes meeting Ethan's. We'll take him down." She didn't need to say more. Her determination was evident in every line of her face, in the way she sat forward, already planning her next steps. Mason had made his moves, but now it was their turn. Ethan gave a faint nod. His eyelids, heavy as exhaustion, overtook him. "You'll need to be careful. Mason has people everywhere, but you've got Ranger. He'll guide you." Rachel stood, placing a hand on Ranger's head. "We'll get him, Ethan. I promise." The days after Ethan's recovery blurred into a series of tense conversations and restless nights. The small room in Ethan's apartment became their war room, with papers scattered across the table and the air thick with unspoken urgency. Rachel sat across from Ethan as he carefully unwrapped the stack of documents he had risked everything to collect. "This is it," Ethan said quietly, his voice still hoarse from the days spent trapped in the warehouse. He slid the files across the table to Rachel, his hands trembling slightly. "This is what Mason wanted. It's all here: financial records, real estate deals, payments to men who do his dirty work. Everything that connects him to the fires and the people he's destroyed." Rachel flipped through the pages, each one more damning than the last. The names, the dates, the sums of money that flowed through Mason's shell companies, it was all laid out in stark detail. This was enough to take Mason down, but Rachel felt a tightening in her chest. They had the evidence, but Mason wouldn't go down easily. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temples. "I didn't know how deep it went until I found these. The fires were just the tip of it. Mason's been running a whole operation: extortion, arson, wiping out anyone who crossed him. I got too close, and that's why he came after me." Rachel's mind raced, piecing together the final steps. "This is enough. We need to take this to Daniels and the detectives. If we can get a warrant, we can finally stop him." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "But we have to be smart about it. Mason has people watching everywhere. If he catches wind of this, he'll disappear before we can make a move." They spent the next hours strategizing, their conversation quiet but tense. Ranger, ever watchful, sat at Rachel's feet, his eyes never leaving her face. The bond between them had grown stronger in these last few days, and Rachel could sense that Ranger, too, knew they were nearing the end. By the following evening, Rachel, Ethan, and Officer Daniels were gathered outside one of Mason's properties on the outskirts of town. The warrant had been issued, and the police were ready to move in. Ethan had guided them here, to a small office building that Mason had been using as his base of operations. Rachel's heart pounded as she stood beside Ethan, their eyes locked on the building. The weight of everything they had uncovered hung between them. They both knew this could be the last chance to stop Mason. "Stay close," Daniels muttered, adjusting his gun belt as he signaled to the other officers. "We go in fast, no hesitation." Ranger stood tense beside Rachel, his body low to the ground, ears perked as if sensing the tension in the air. His eyes darted from Rachel to the building, alert and ready. The plan was simple. The officers would raid the office while Rachel and Ethan stayed close by, prepared to provide any evidence needed. But as they approached, something shifted. Rachel could feel it. The air seemed heavier, the darkness around the building more oppressive. Mason was inside, and he knew they were coming. Daniels signaled, and the officers moved in. The front door was breached with a swift kick, and within seconds they were inside, sweeping through the rooms. Rachel and Ethan stayed just behind them, watching as the tension built, every creak of the building heightening the pressure. Then they found him. Walter Mason stood in the center of a back office, his face impassive, though his eyes flickered with something like recognition when he saw Ethan. His hands were raised, but his smirk suggested he hadn't quite accepted defeat. "Well?" Mason said, his voice smooth. "I can't say I'm surprised." The officers surrounded him, weapons drawn, but it was Ranger who made the first move. The dog lunged forward, sniffing the air, circling around Mason's desk. He barked sharply, his nose leading him to a hidden drawer. Daniels gave a quick nod, and another officer yanked the drawer open, revealing a stash of cash, documents, and keys to several properties around town, all linked to Mason's operations. Rachel felt her breath catch in her throat as the realization sunk in. Ranger had done it. He'd found the last piece of the puzzle. Mason's smirk faded as he watched the evidence pile up against him. His carefully constructed empire was crumbling before his eyes. The arrest itself was swift and silent. Mason, for all his bravado, was led out in handcuffs, his gaze dark but resigned. The officers filed out, and as they did, the air around the town seemed to lighten, as though a long-standing shadow had finally been lifted. Rachel stood still for a moment, taking it all in. The weight of the past few weeks fell from her shoulders, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. She looked down at Ranger, who was panting but calm, his tail wagging slightly. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light across the quiet streets of Maplewood. The town had settled into a calm that Rachel hadn't felt in weeks. Mason was in custody, his empire of fear dismantled, and the weight that had pressed on everyone's shoulders seemed to lift, if only slightly. The fire trucks weren't patrolling the streets anymore, and the smell of smoke no longer lingered in the air. Rachel walked slowly along the familiar path, Ranger trotting contentedly at her side. His tail wagged lazily, and every now and then he would glance up at her as if checking to see if she was all right. It had become their routine, these morning walks, now less about finding clues and more about finding peace. They stopped by the edge of the park, where children were playing, their laughter filling the air. Rachel leaned against the fence, watching them with a faint smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't bracing herself for another disaster. Ranger sat quietly beside her, eyes fixed on the horizon. He had been the true hero in all of this, she knew. His persistence, his loyalty, it had led them through the darkness and into the light. She reached down, scratching behind his ears. "We're all right now, aren't we, boy?" Ranger gave a soft woof, his tail thumping the ground in agreement. Later that day, Rachel made her way to the hospital to visit Ethan. He was recovering well, though the bruises and cuts still marked his face, reminders of how close they'd come to losing him. When she entered his room, Ethan looked up, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hey," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Hey yourself," Rachel replied, sitting in the chair beside his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Better every day, thanks to you. And Ranger." He chuckled lightly, wincing a little as he shifted in the bed. Rachel waved him off. "We just followed the trail you left. You did the hard work." Ethan's gaze softened, and for a moment the weight of everything they'd been through hung between them. Neither needed to say it. The danger, the fear, the uncertainty. It was all still there, but muted now, replaced by something steadier, more hopeful. "They're holding a ceremony tomorrow," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "For Ranger, mostly. But I think we're both getting a little recognition." Rachel nodded. She'd heard about the ceremony, but she hadn't thought much about it. It wasn't about the accolades, after all. Still, there was something reassuring in the idea that the town wanted to show its gratitude, not just to her and Ethan, but to Ranger. The next morning, the square was filled with townspeople, familiar faces, people Rachel had passed every day but had barely noticed before the fires. Now, as she stood among them, the connection felt deeper, as if they had all survived something together. Children waved at Ranger as he trotted through the crowd, and Rachel felt a swell of pride watching him. The mayor stood at a small podium, speaking in a solemn tone about the bravery of the town's heroes. Ethan stood beside Rachel, leaning on a crutch, his eyes scanning the crowd, but every now and then they flickered toward her. The bond between them had grown slowly, quietly, through shared moments of fear and determination. It wasn't something either of them needed to discuss. It simply was. When Ranger's name was called, a cheer went up from the crowd. Rachel knelt down, placing a hand on his back as he looked up at her with those deep, trusting eyes. The mayor handed her a small medal, and she clipped it gently onto Ranger's collar. He didn't seem to mind the attention, but his eyes stayed on Rachel as if saying, "We did it." As the ceremony came to a close, Rachel and Ethan walked side by side through the town square, their steps slow and unhurried. They spoke quietly, sharing glances and the kind of easy conversation that didn't need to fill the silence. "You ever think about what's next?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Rachel smiled, glancing at him out of the corner of her eye. "I try not to plan too far ahead." Ethan chuckled softly. Fair enough. There was something in his tone, in the way they walked side by side, that hinted at more. A shared future, maybe, but there was no rush. Wow, what an intense journey. From the moment Ranger blocked that ambulance, we were pulled into a mystery deeper than anyone could have imagined. The courage of Ethan and the determination of Rachel, and let's not forget Ranger, show us that sometimes the most unexpected heroes can make all the difference. This story isn't just about exposing a criminal mastermind like Mason. It's about perseverance, loyalty, and how one person, or even one dog, can turn the tide against injustice. If this gripping tale kept you on the edge of your seat like it did for me, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that keep you thinking long after the screen goes dark. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay determined, and remember, sometimes the smallest clues can lead to the biggest breakthroughs.